Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
Still Sabastian joining us here again, the founder and creator of Nobelia.org. We're here to talk more about the way of impeccability and moreness and how he's helping change so many through his amazing programs based out of Cottonwood, Arizona. But he's worldwide renowned and been helping so many with his programs for such a long time. Go to his Facebook page. Check out the Facebook group as well. I know that's a good one. Syl Sabastian, SYL, SABASTIAN. You could just Google him. And the name of the group, it's Self-Awareness, Self-Improvement.
Yes. Self-discovery discussion group. Yes.
Perfect. Well, we're excited to have you.
Yeah, you can just type in SASI.
SASI on Facebook. You could see what he's up to and how he's helping so many. What are you up to, by the way? I see you were busy today on Facebook.
Yes. I'm doing on Facebook, and I've been doing it for a while now, for a long time. I do daily live. I had a gap there for a while. I was a little bit ill, but a daily live in which I do capital R readings. Now, what is a capital R reading? By implication, it's reading with depth, reading with perception, reading with perspective, reading with greater context. And this is a very cool way to read things. So we've done a bunch of things. I did books that I've written, and we did Musashi's Book of Five Rings. We did fairly recently, and that was pretty cool. Because on many of these, like Musashi, just to give a bit of background, once upon a time in my youth, I used to read like crazy, right? I mean, I would read at least a book a day all throughout my teenage years.
Wow.
And one year I even read 2 books a day. Yes. So I read tremendously because I would read in the dead times, right? There's like waiting in line. You wait in line a lot. I always had a book on me, and in those, few seconds or minutes, I'd sit and read. Or like you wait for the teacher to come, you read, right? Or when the teacher leaves early, you can read, right? So this is all dead time, and I filled it all up. I would go to the bank, for instance. I'd do errands for my mother, and waiting in line at the bank, I'd be reading, or in the supermarket, wherever. So, of course, when you use all of that dead time, that's why I got to read tremendously a lot, because it didn't mean I wasn't doing other things, playing sports or whatever, hanging out with my friends. So I did that also, didn't just only read. Anyway, so as I'm reading, I start to read a little bit more serious stuff, get away from just reading adventure novels and detective stories and whatever. And so I'm reading Hermann Hesse. And Hermann Hesse talks about Nietzsche. And I said, who's this Nietzsche guy? Right? And now, keep in mind, I'm completely in a bubble. I'm about the only person that I know that actually reads books. And I have nobody to talk to about any of this, right? I'm in a very conservative community, which, oh my goodness, if they'd known the things that I was reading, they would have had a heart attack. Even though, I got from the library, but still, just the general community at the school, extremely conservative. A few steps away from Amish, really. It's quite amazing. All right, so who's this Nietzsche guy? I need to know who Nietzsche is. So I look up Nietzsche, and of course Nietzsche starts talking about, right, he starts talking about Schopenhauer, and he starts talking about Kant, and I'm like, man, all right, this is very cool, but I don't want to be just jumping from reference to reference, right? Yeah. And of course, all of them, they refer back to the Greeks. Now, that's where I started reading. When I was 10, I started reading the Greek myths, Robert Graves' Greek myths. Very cool way of reading it, by the way, if anybody's interested in that. So I did have some understanding of the Greek myths, but there was others, not just the Greek myths, but, Plato, Aristotle, and then all the playwrights, Aristophanes and Sophocles and so on, right? All of them. So I said, I want to know all of these references. I don't want to just be jumping around left, right, and center. So I set about what became my great reading project. I set about finding all the classics that there were, and I said, I'm going to read all of the classics. Now, this is pre-internet days. So just keep in mind, when you don't have the internet to go and do your research, to find the list of all the great classics, this was quite an endeavor, by the way. It took me quite a while to do this. And I started looking around, and eventually I found this pamphlet. Just, I have no idea where, in a bookshop somewhere, I think maybe. A pamphlet that was it was like for publishers, right? and they put out all the list of books in their Penguin Classic series. Brilliant. Finally, I've got the list, right? This is on paper, hard copy, because there's no internet. This is pre-internet days, right? This is in the late 70s. So I get this list, and then I sort of started to reach a bit more, and I found another from Encyclopedia Britannica. They had a great book series, and I did. And then I went and asked people, like my English teacher, whom I liked a lot, and my previous English teacher also. I had to go back to the previous town that I lived in, and I went to look him up. And I still remember that incident. His name was Mr. Ackerman. He called everybody Lassie. So, well, at least the girls. So his nickname was Lassie. So I knew where he lived, and I knocked on his door one evening just before dinner time. A very strategic choice of timing, anyway. But so I explained to him, and when I explained to him why I was there, he was very surprised to see me, of course. And when I explained to him, he was almost in tears, because you could see on his face, I got through to at least one, because he was basically teaching Philistines, and we did Shakespeare and stuff like this, but nobody in the class had any connection. So I come and ask him for his recommendations to add to my list, and he gave me some interesting recommendations which weren't already on my list. All right, so now I'm reading on my list, and the next step, of course, was to acquire these books, because I didn't want to get them from the library. I wanted to own them, because I wanted to underline in them and pull out all the value and the knowledge, because it wasn't just about the references, it was also about learning and growing. So now I have to set about acquiring the book. And to make that list, it took me about a year and a bit. And then to acquire them took me another year or two. And then I started to read them. And that, took a bunch of years as well. And that was during the time I did military service, because it was conscription at the time, 2 years. So luckily, lots of time. Of course, you spend a lot of time doing nothing in the army. So I was reading. Anyway. So this whole project got me to see the context of things. Now, what resulted, I didn't get as much actual learning value as what I thought. It was quite depressing, and I'll get to the end of that in a moment. But what was of value was seeing how thought and knowledge and conception and culture, how it evolved. And you can see the growth of it. There are questions that get left unanswered, and then somebody comes along sometime later, sometimes centuries later, doesn't matter. And then this major question that really bothers people gets resolved. And you can see this in the Bible, for instance. You can see that same progression of thought, right? Like we get the book of Job, and what is the answer to Job, where he says, but why? Why did you have me suffer all of these things? And the answer is, because I'm God. And of course, it's a very unsatisfactory answer, right? I mean, if you're a faithful person and you say, well, I'm faithful too, but I could be afflicted with boils and wounds and my children could die and all sorts of horrible things. And well, that doesn't seem right, And so after Job, you see the fall of religion, right? All those later books in the Last Testament, right? Jedediah and Ezekiel and Isaiah and all that. All of the prophets, and they're all telling them, woe be unto you, you be a stiff-necked people, because they weren't concerned with religion, because religion had lost its value. Well, if I'm going to be faithful and I'm going to get, basically screwed over completely and utterly, then what's the point? I might as well just be wicked, right? So there's no reason to be religious. But then along comes Jesus, and he says there is, because you're going to go to heaven if you are good, right? So he gives this answer to Job. You see the evolution philosophically of the conceptions, right? So it's a major, major upgrade into why be religious. And that's just within the Bible. But when I was reading this, for me, I always had overview perspective. I don't know, it's just something I always had. So I always looked at this bigger overview. And you can see this entire progression, this evolution of thinking, of philosophy, of conception, of culture, of society, of morals, of values, etc. See this great evolution. Right now, of course, when you go through that reading, when I started to get to about the 1800s around there, yes, there had been some evolution, because you'd also have gone through the Dark Ages, and then kind of things went backward. A lot of the learning was lost, right? All that Greek stuff during the Middle Ages, all the the excellence that came about through the Greek Golden Age of Plato, Aristotle, etc., that all was lost, and it kind of came back. So when it did come back, European culture. Now, when I read my great reading project, this wasn't just Western; it was as much of the whole world that I could find. There was very little at the time that I could get Chinese and Japanese, but I read Confucius and Mencius and a couple of others too, and so I did have that. And of course, part of that reading was uh, Sun Tzu, Art of War, very famous book. It's very popular in business culture, and of course, Miyamoto Musashi's Book of Five Rings, right? And these are about strategy, very powerful. But nonetheless, as you come to the end of this, the classics as they were, you start to get to the 17, 1800s. You get the classics who are like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Balzac and all this. Very negative stuff. Oh my God, it was depressing as all get out. Yeah, I only read it because I wanted to finish my list. Simply through thoroughness and stubborn perseverance did I now persist through all of that boring stuff. Right? And the philosophers also, Kant, Berkeley, Locke, Hume, I put them all together as the great big boring four. Oh my goodness, they're disastrously boring to read. Yes, they made a difference, especially Kant, right? They did evolve things, and they did, but boy, it's just tough going, right? So I was getting a bit depressed. Like, I'm reading all of this and I'm getting very little value. But then, right at the very end, when I made my list, I asked this one guy at school. He was in my same class, but he was an older boy, and he was kind of an outlier, right? And I said, he also read. So I asked him, this is in the very last year of my school. So he said, oh, you must read Carlos Castaneda. And he said, and Carlos Castaneda, he said, you must read them in order. And he emphasized this like multiple times. And it was very anomalous to me. I put it on my list and it was right at the very end of the list. So I'm coming to the end of my reading, and I'm not very encouraged, but okay, I'm pursuing. And of
Yeah.
course, when I do get to read Carlos Castaneda, this is a revelation for me. Why? Because I start to see my own philosophy expressed back at me. And when I was reading, I said, I really want what I want. I started to delineate what I wanted. I really want moreness. I want something that where the communication, the language is really good. Because the Buddhist whole Buddhist canon is huge, huge Buddhist canon. I read all tons of Buddhist stuff, fantastic stuff. But the language is it's from way back when. Right? It's just that old language, and it doesn't quite click with one's brain.
Yeah.
It's very sophisticated. It's a lot of depth to it, but it doesn't resonate. So yeah, I come and of course at the time, Carlos was still a big deal then. This was not very long after he had been on the cover of Time magazine. So
Yeah.
he was quite a cultural influence. In 1973, he was on the cover of Time magazine. And that stuff always has, many years later, the effect is still around. So, but of course, Carlos, a lot of people if you think of Carlos now, oh, it's all about psychedelics and hallucinogens and power plants and all this, but they missed the entire point of it. So when I read book one, I was totally, yes, he's talking about his peyote and all this. None of that interested me because I couldn't get value and usefulness from it. I said, I don't know anybody who can, I don't have access to peyote. I don't have access to somebody to do it with. And so none of it is of any relevance to me. But the other things that Don Juan said, even in that first book, I pulled out a very few quotes, but they were enough. Like seek and see the marvels all around you. That really grabbed me because this was something that I had already for my own self, through my own cultivation, because in all my reading, I had been developing, I'd been on this path of awareness from age 10. So I'd created my own worldview, my own philosophy. I didn't know it. I was so modest and so humble, I never even clicked, had
Yeah.
no inkling that I'd created. When I started to read Carlos, actually, it happened with Nietzsche as well.
Yeah.
The first time I experienced this, Nietzsche said a particular sentence, and it really stopped me because I had said that exact sentence the week before, and I'm like, but how does this work? Like, how does this? How can it? It was really something really quite profound, and I was really surprised because Nietzsche's a translation. I'm reading it in English, not in German. Doesn't matter, and it still didn't click to me that I figured stuff out, but I never thought that I had, because I grew up in a very modest culture, very humble culture. That's part of, that's like I said, it's modern Amish culture, you could call it at the time, right? So anyway, so I'm reading Carlos, and I'm starting to recognize all of the things that I had, and that was really powerful to me. And of course, then the language as well. Yeah, Don Juan's usage of language. Now, a lot of people, when they read Carlos, they want to be Carlos. I never wanted to be Carlos. Carlos is an idiot, right? But they all want to be Carlos. They want to be apprentice. I said, no, of course, you're going to want to be Don Juan, for heaven's sake. How can you want to be Carlos? Carlos is a knucklehead, right? He's a fool. Anyway, so the whole reading, the whole series then, I read as much as I could. At the time, they weren't all published yet. So I remember the next book in the series at the time, it was called The Fire from Within. I was walking past the bookshop that I regularly think it was between our home and the supermarket. So I'd walk by it, whenever we're going to the supermarket. And since I would do the shopping for the family, I walked by pretty much every day. When that book came out, I had walked just past the door. This was a thin, little, narrow store with kind of a door set back a little bit, right, with the glass windows in the front. And I'd just gone past the center of the door when I felt a tug, a tug on me to go inside. And I knew there was another. And there it was. It's quite amazing. It was a very unusual experience for me. A very significant experience.
Wow.
I'm like, holy moly, wow, this is really something. So the books have a moreness for me. And I underlined them all, and I pulled them out. And then later, when I started a restaurant, a very long story, but I had a computer, one of the very first PCs, right? An 8086 PC. Anybody who knows about PCs knows that was the very first
thing. Oh my gosh.
It was such a huge deal, exactly, right? It was the very first personal computer. Now, of course, it came blank, and you got that screen there, right? Black screen and the cursor, and you had to program it yourself. But also, by the time I'd gotten it, it had been a year or two, and the software was just starting to come out. And so where you could actually load the software, and you didn't have to program the thing yourself. And Lotus 1.3 came out. Oh my goodness, this was a revelation. This changed so much. But if you really want to study business history and part of your culture, go look up Lotus 1.3 and the significance of it. The first spreadsheet program. Today we don't even know the name anymore, but it's what started everything, right? At the time, it was the only spreadsheet program. But this was transformative. So I took the spreadsheet program, and I took all of the quotes from the Carlos books, all Don Juan's quotes, and I put them into the spreadsheet. Why? Because you could sort in a spreadsheet. At that time, in a word processor, you couldn't really sort. Or at least if you could, you couldn't sort by columns, right? Because what I did is I took all of the quotes and I tagged them. I said, right, this belongs to Warrior's Way, this belongs to self-importance, this belongs to erasing personal history, this belongs to dreaming. Now, I tagged it, in other words. Now, tagging, today, we don't think anything of tagging. Back then, there was no such word as tagging either, right? It was a new, completely revolutionary thing to do. I mean, I just was doing it for practical value. I didn't even think of it as tagging, right? So what I could do was I could take all of my quotes, and I could, through the tagging, I could sort by the different columns, and I could arrange all of the things by topic across all of the books. Right, so when Don Juan talked about perception, right, seeing as he called it, right, which is perceiving energy directly, I could have all the quotes related to seeing, all the quotes related to dreaming, etc. And this was very cool. It was a very cool thing. So I utilized that, and I was able to see the overview, see the bigger picture, which is of course very important to me. And then as time went by, it took me a long time, many decades, before I started to realize how much of it connected my own stuff that I already had, right? And this was very powerful. And then also Don Juan said at one point, he says to Carlos, he says, a warrior must take what he has been shown and take it further. Right?
Wow.
And I really applied that. I really did that. Because just today, and you asked what I was doing in the live earlier, I am doing a reading of reading of the Carlos Castaneda books. Really, what we are doing is we are reading Don Juan. We don't care about Carlos. Carlos is a knucklehead by his own admission, and certainly by Don Juan's. Don Juan calls him a fool to his face many times because a fool and an idiot, right? But there's a moreness to the books. And
Okay.
I've been sharing this in that when you read them, you have to understand attunement. Now, Don Juan
Okay.
doesn't use this word attunement, but everything he does is attunement and
Got it.
anomalies, right? It's part of the Way of Impeccability program, attunement and anomalies. And this is me taking things further. There are many other things that I do in Way of Impeccability. Yes, Don Juan uses this word
Mm-hmm.
impeccability multiple times. It's a huge deal for him. But also attunement. He says it's important, but in different ways. He doesn't quite go into detail
Yep.
on it. But when you understand, like for instance, when Carlos takes that very first time he engages, he says peyote and he annoys Don Juan because it's Mescalito. When he first encounters Mescalito and Mescalito plays with Carlos, this
Yep.
is anomalous. Now, Don Juan doesn't say it's anomalous, but he says it's unusual, different. But if had he said it's anomalous, and when you have a true anomaly, capital A anomaly, it is a communication from the universe, a communication from your deeper self, a communication from God, Allah, whatever you want to say, it doesn't matter. It's a communication from moreness. And it's something really, really to pay attention to. Because if you do pay attention to anomalies, you see the wonder, the magic, the moreness, the awesome of it, right? And this is how Don Juan lives. Don
Ah,
Juan lives entirely in a tune. And Carlos can't grasp this initially. He can't get it. He doesn't understand it because he doesn't understand the two concepts, attunement and anomaly. But when you do, it's profound. And there's an incredible moreness to it. And this is the capital R reading. And I'm saying all of this because when we're reading this, like when we read Musashi, I used to own a sword and a knife store, and we sold a lot of, all the samurai swords, all of that stuff. And many of the customers I had were deeply into this. So as a result, I studied much of that culture, samurai culture,
mm-hmm.
Bushido, etc. And I'd already read, before that, but in the store. So I have a greater understanding of the context of Musashi. And this greatly helps when reading Musashi. And likewise, when reading Carlos, I also have that context from my own personal experience of the times, right? And yes, I was very young in the late 60s, but still the effect of that whole hippie era, the hippie culture, even though it wasn't very big where I grew up in South Africa, the cultural awareness of it was there, right? Even though it was something that was seen as very negative, it still put in your mind, hey, these people are doing all of this stuff and they're pursuing stuff, and the music, of course, that was there. It makes you think there must be something here if everybody,
Mm-hmm.
if there's a significant group of people that are doing it, right? So that it had a major, major impact on people's awareness, on their psychology. Even if they didn't necessarily go and be hippies, it still put the idea in your head of monks. And we see this culturally. The legacy of it is still here today. And Carlos and Peyote, you see the legacy of it today with Ayurveda, right? It was a huge deal then, and then Peyote sort of went down, and
Yeah.
it fell a bit by the wayside. Well, the Church of Peyote was a big deal. See, again, extra cultural context. Peyote is technically illegal, except that you can go and join the Church of Peyote in Arizona, I believe it is, and become a member and legally take peyote, right? If you so choose.
Mm-hmm.
But it declined, much like LSD was a huge deal after Timothy Leary said this was the biggest thing ever, right? And he was this Harvard professor. So LSD took off, and it wasn't illegal at the time, and became illegal after that. So the whole journey, though, culturally, there's a lot more to it, and this is just in the hallucinogens, which for me personally, I have
Yeah.
no interest in, yeah? but still for others. But that's not what captures me with Don Juan. It is the philosophical, the practical
Yeah.
value. Because when I was reading all of my great reading project, my intent was I want practical usefulness. Way of Impeccability is all about, it's a
Yeah.
practical philosophy. It's all about practical. Again, throughout the program, you'll hear me say, without application, it's all meaningless. I'll say it 1,000 times. And that's the core of where I come from. I'm all about application, practicality. And this is what grabbed me with Don Juan. What he said from not to do with it, because later on in the books, it comes to light that Don Juan says, well, the power plants, the hallucinogens, we only had to do this with you because you were such a knucklehead. And we had to kind of shift you and break you out of your bubble. Most other people, they do it once or not at all. They don't need
Mm-hmm.
it, right? But you needed it. So the emphasis shifted. And again, to the culture, Carlos is very in tune with culture.
Yeah.
People came to realize that, the path to moreness is not through drugs, right? And so there's still a little bit of that old legacy out there, but it's not necessary. Yes, you can get value, but you can also get the value out of it. And that's what I do. That's what my writing is about, what my course is all about. Just Capital H's hearing. This is another way of saying human. Yeah, to actually hear somebody. Yes, this is important, but to hear the universe, now you really. Yes.
Absolutely.
So that's to wrap up there. Sorry, I got a whole long speech here, but it's
That's
very,
okay.
very
I love when it comes out.
topic.
And I think your phone's
Yes.
ringing now. Sorry. Well, I hope you could take the call. This is a great
I
conversation.
love it. Yes.
I learned how much reading is important. Reading. My boys are 7 and 9, and with the summer came, we stopped reading.
Yes.
We need to read more again.
Never,
Thanks for that
never
reminder. Thank you.
Yes.
And tell us how we can reach you, Sil, one more time.
Nobelia.org. And if you really want to connect, /apply.
Thank you so much. You have a fantastic day. And I love the background today. I love the guy there on the hill jumping up. Anything is possible, right?
Exactly.
Seriously,
you can see the marbles all around you.
Yes. Thank you so much. You have a fantastic day. To all of our listeners, stay tuned. We'll be right back with more. Bye-bye.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you now have even more ways to listen live. Check out the MyTuner Radio, online radio box, and Simple Radio apps on iOS and Android, or find us online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com, or search Podcast Business News Network on streama.com and onlineradiobox.com/US. Take your podcast on the go and don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house. And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned. This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.